When you learned about Spanish colonialism in the Americas in high school history class, you probably learned that they were motivated by gold and God, or the desire for precious metals and to convert the natives to Christianity, right? Well, it was considerably more complicated than that and much more interesting. To understand the mindset of Spanish conquistadors in the 15th century, we need to dig deeper into Spanish cultures at that time, which had their own complicated and torturous histories. First of all, if we take the year 1500 as a baseline, Spain did not exist as a united country. This map is of the region of Iberia, or the Iberian Peninsula. It contains the modern-day countries of Spain and Portugal. In the year 1500, however, it consisted of 5 separate kingdoms. The boundaries of the Kingdom of Portugal were then essentially as they are today. However, what is now Spain consisted of 4 separate kingdoms: Navarre, Granada, Castile, and Aragon. The kingdoms of Castile and Aragon had been loosely united due to the marriage in 1469 of Isabel of Castile, often called Isabella in English, and Fernando of Aragon, often called Ferdinand in English. The kingdoms were not unified as a single kingdom until 1715 under King Philip V. Consequently, when we talk about the Spanish conquest of the New World, the terminology is not quite precise. The political venture was sponsored by Castile and Aragon, and the language introduced was the Castilian variety of Spanish. The cultural practices and values that shaped the Spanish invasion of the Americas emerged out of a long political struggle that has been called the Reconquest. This reconquest has been characterized as Iberian Christians taking back lands that had been invaded by Muslims from North Africa. The region of North Africa is called the Maghreb, and the ethnic and linguistic group were the Berbers, whose religion was Islam. They entered Iberia from across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar in AD 711. The Iberian Christians called these Berbers from North Africa the Moors, Moros. This image represents medieval Spanish and Berber clothing styles. The subsequent nearly 8 centuries of political struggle over Iberia have been described as a reconquest. This political struggle informed Spanish cultural ideas about conquest, political rule, glory, social status, and religious intolerance. The Muslim part of Spanish heritage is less well known to U.S. audiences, but the impact was significant. The Berbers introduced Arabic mathematics, medicine, irrigation and waterworks technologies, and art and architectural styles. These photos are of Berber architecture from the Spanish medieval period. Fun fact: about 4,000 words in the modern Spanish language have Arabic roots dating back to this time period, including ojalá, meaning if God wills it, from the Arabic inshallah, algoritmo, algorithm, algebra, ajedrez, chess, noria, water wheel, azúcar, sugar, adobe, café, coffee, guitarra, guitar, and momia, or mummy. The long period of AD 718 to 1492 has been called the Reconquest. It is important to detail what it was and what it was not. It was largely an economic and political struggle. The Berbers in many parts of Iberia, particularly in the south, had taken over lands and subjugated some Iberian Christians as feudal serfs who paid them tribute. In the battles of the Reconquest, then, Christians in the peninsula aimed to take control of lands and then subjugate those whom they called the Moors as their feudal serfs. Another important motive was a social one. In the context of these feudal battles, a man could rise up in social status by becoming a caballero, a term which means both a gentleman and a man on a horse. Knights were also called caballeros. Horses were expensive and therefore symbols of wealth. A man on a horse could sit above and oversee peasants who worked the land and herded sheep. Manual labor was looked down upon, and all men aspired to be caballeros above and commanding the labor of others. A related social status was that of the hidalgo. The term comes from hijo de algo, meaning son of something or a person of consequence. An hidalgo was a petty noble, someone not born into nobility, but who secured the title through achievements such as military service. Conquest of lands and subjugation of others were part of the process of becoming a caballero or hidalgo. However, because the battles of the Reconquest were largely between people of different religions, it became reconceptualized in religious terms. Success in battle was interpreted as proof of God's favor. Consequently, some Spanish Christians began to interpret their political struggle, if not as a holy war, then at least a war in which God favored them. Over time, these military struggles fostered religious intolerance. The Spanish Christians claimed as a patron saint Saint James the Apostle, who is called Santiago in Spanish. A patron saint in medieval Christianity was a saint who looked out for and protected his devotees. Tales would circulate of Spanish Christians witnessing a miraculous apparition of Santiago on the battlefield. These apparitions were interpreted as a sign that God was on their side. The city of Compostela is the capital of the northwestern province of Galicia. According to legend, the remains of the Apostle St. James were brought to Compostela for burial. Compostela became an important pilgrimage center as people would make pilgrimages there to pray for Santiago's blessings. By the 12th century AD, the Way of St. James had become the third largest pilgrimage for European Catholics, third only after Rome and Jerusalem. The association of Santiago and the fight against the Muslim Berbers became so strong that he became known as Santiago Matamoros de Compostela, St. James the Moor Killer. Galician soldiers went to battle against the Muslim Berbers under the banner of St. James, who was depicted on a white horse, wearing a white robe, and carrying a sword. This photo is of the icon of Santiago in the cathedral in Compostela. You can see that he, on the white horse, is trampling Moors below, including one's severed head. This is a 12th century banner of St. James of Compostela as depicted in the Codex Callistinus. We can see, therefore, that the Christian reconquest of Iberia forged various Spanish cultural values, including disdain for manual labor, a desire to be the caballero or the hidalgo supervising someone else's labor, militarism, religious intolerance, and religious militarism, or the willingness to go to battle against people of other faiths. These cultural values became the basis for patterns of Spanish colonialism in the Americas, as we will see. Religious chauvinism could be defined as the belief that one's own religion was superior to others' religions, which should be stamped out. The religious chauvinism of the Reconquest had other manifestations in the medieval Spanish kingdoms. The so-called Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, established the Holy Inquisition in their kingdoms in 1478. Its initial goal was to root out heresy, or a bastardization of the Christian faith among recent converts to Christianity who had converted from Judaism or Islam. The year 1492 represented the height of religious militarism in the Spanish kingdoms, as seen in three important events. On January 2nd, Castilian and Aragonese forces captured the last remaining Muslim-controlled city on the peninsula, Granada, as shown in this painting. Iberia was now fully under Christian rule. Then on March 30th, the Catholic monarchs issued the Edict of Expulsion, requiring that all Jews convert to Christianity or be expelled. Then a third significant event occurred on October 12th, when Christopher Columbus, sailing for the Catholic monarchs, accidentally discovered the islands of the Bahamas. A decade later, in 1502, Muslims in Granada were similarly commanded to either convert to Christianity or be expelled from the Spanish kingdoms. This painting by Edwin Long represents a mass baptism of Muslims under such pressure. Where was Portugal in all of this? The Kingdom of Portugal on the Atlantic coast, with a significant seafaring tradition, was heading in a different direction. As you know, if we take the year 1400, most of what the Europeans considered to be riches were found in what they called the East Indies, Eastern and Southern Asia. European traders wanted access to silk, porcelain, gold, ivory, and spices. This Belgian painting, dating to 1504, depicts the unloading of trade goods brought back from India. The Portuguese were in a difficult position, though, because Muslim traders controlled the overland Middle Eastern trade routes to the East Indies. This image represents the overland Silk Road trades to China. Consequently, Portugal needed to find another route to the Indies. Prince Henry the Navigator established a school for explorers in 1419, and craftsmen set about to building a vast fleet of ships. A series of explorers set out to discover a southern route to the East Indies, intending to sail around the southern tip of Africa if they could find it. These Portuguese explorers discovered the so-called Atlantic Islands off the western coast of Africa, islands including the Azores, Madeira, and Cape Verdes, as shown on this map. The Portuguese simultaneously initiated large-scale trade in Africans captured as slaves. In fact, these Atlantic islands were the site for the first European-controlled African slave-based agricultural plantations. Sugar was enormously valuable in European markets at the time. The Portuguese discovered that these Atlantic islands had a climate favorable to growing sugar, and they brought in enslaved Africans to work sugarcane plantations that they established there. Also significantly, in 1488, Bartholomew Diaz managed to sail around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, and he reached India. The Portuguese subsequently had a lock on the southern route to the Indies. What that meant for the Catholic monarchs of Castile and Aragon, however, was that if they wanted to trade extensively in the Indies, they needed to find another route. They couldn't go overland, and they couldn't take the southern route. Maybe they could reach it by sailing west. And we know what happens next. Next time, we'll pick up our story with Christopher Columbus.